have to.
Et nos amours, faut-il qu'ils m'en souviennent?
Welcome to The Thing About France, a podcast where American cultural figures explore the fascinating and complicated relationship between France and America. I'm Bénédicte de Montlaur, and this is The Thing About France. Jonathan Galassi has been the head of the publishing house Farrar, Straus Giroux, FSG, for more than 30 years. The most literary publishing house in the US. I met him 2 years ago during a lunch at my apartment. We had invited major New York publishers to discover the French authors and the rentrée littéraire in general. We were thrilled that Jonathan accepted our invitation. He is the Antoine Gallimard of America, and Gallimard is a literary rock star in France. Jonathan Galassi was extremely accessible. He walked over to my apartment one morning, carrying a giant tote bag of French poetry. We talked about Michel Houellebecq, how French authors get published in the US, French and American poetry, and his favorite spots in Paris. It was a wonderful and poetic morning, as you'll hear. Allez, c'est parti. So welcome, Jonathan Galassi, to The Thing About France, our podcast. I'm really honored to have you today.
It's a great honor for me. I'm such a fan of everything you do at the French Cultural Service in New York. It's really a big part of our cultural life here.
Thank you. And just to remind our audience, so you're the president and publisher of one of New York's most prominent houses, Farrar, Straus Giroux, FSG. And in that capacity, you've been a fierce defender of French literature. Under your leadership, the house has published major French-speaking authors such as Emmanuel Carrère, Michel Houellebecq, Laurent Binet, Edouard Louis, Amin Mahalouf, Maëlys de Kerangal, and many others, but also classics like Colette and Marguerite Yourcenar, Marguerite Duras. And of course, it's not only French authors. At FSG, you continually publish translated literature. I think this is really important, especially that people say it's a very hard sell in America. How do you pick at FSG the interest of your readers when you publish translated literature?
I think the history of translated literature in America has to do with the isolated geography of America. Originally, after all, we were an ocean away from Europe. We were founded by Europeans, but the people who came here came to get away from a culture that they didn't feel at home in. So there's always been an anti-intellectual strain in one part of our culture. At the same time, America has in the 20th century especially, became very enmeshed in world affairs and therefore much more aware and interested. And the whole history of American literature is partly about people like Henry James going to Europe and learning about the past and learning about a more sophisticated culture that was in some ways perhaps threatening to certain Americans, but also very attractive. And I would say that in the later part of the 20th century, with American political dominance in the world, there was much more of a convergence. But still, that background is part of our cultural heritage. And so if you say French books translated are 19%, that you're right next to Germany, you're right next to Italy, Spain, England is right across the channel. You have to be reading those books because that's your situation. Our situation has historically been different.
So you don't need the rest of the world.
Well, it's our own kind of Brexit. We didn't think we needed the world, of course. And there are lots of Americans who feel that way. But I think the reading public has become more and more aware of the interplay. After all, we're in a world of the internet where everything is all interplay all the time. And so I think if you look at publishing in the last 20 years, there have been huge foreign authors who've made huge impacts.
Like Elena Ferrante.
Yes, for instance, or someone like Bolaño, Roberto Bolaño. These people have become. Elena Ferrante is an international writer, really, and you might sometimes it even happens that they have a success here that echoes back.
Absolutely.
In Europe.
But at the end of the day, it's really a question of demand. Like publishers, I guess most publishers, they would like to publish a lot of translated literature, but they have to take into consideration what the audience wants. And so most of the time, it's harder to sell a book written by a foreign author.
I think there are two kinds of publishing you can do. One is to lead people to new things. The other is to give them what you think they want. And there's always a kind of, how would you say, negotiation going on between, if you lead them, if you're too far ahead of them, they're not going to follow you. So you have to catch the wave, as it were, of interest.
So for you, was it a fight, like something you really wanted to do, to publish foreign literature?
I'll give you an example of something where I never had success. I published Yves Bonnefoy twice, both at Random House and at FSG. And he's possibly the greatest 20th century French poet of the second period, and a wonderful man, many very well known here, etc. But there was no real context for him here, and I never had any success in finding him readers, which I'm ashamed of, because I loved his work.
It was a huge challenge because he's French, plus he's a poet.
Well,
it's not a
yes,
novel.
But there are many other, I've had success with other things. I did this book when I was at Random House in the early 80s, the Random House book of 20th century French poetry.
At this point, Jonathan lifts up this giant book of French poems. It feels like a sacred encyclopedia.
Edited by Paul Auster. This was before Paul became a famous writer. But he knows French poetry inside out. And this is one of the best anthologies ever published. And it was published over 30 years ago, and it's still in print. It was reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review. So you can have big successes in poetry. And this is really a question I wanted to ask you, in fact, because, we have a bookstore, Albertine, at the Cultural Services. So we organize literary events almost every night. Mm-hmm. And we find it's always more difficult with poetry, even though, in Paris, there is this place called La Maison de la Poésie, which is a center dedicated to contemporary poetry. And it's extremely successful because they are very innovative. Mm-hmm. So what is the magic formula, to get the audience interested in poetry? Well, I'm sure that if you snoop around, which I'm sure you have, you'll see that poetry is hugely active cultural sector in New York in all sorts of different ways. There's poetry readings all the time in the universities, in bookstores, in cafes. Some of them involve translations. Some of them involve other cultures. There's a lot of cultural politics that expresses itself in the poetic realm. That's particularly true today. A lot of identity politics. Everywhere, but also in poetry. But poetry is one of the vanguard areas for that. How? There are a lot of poets of color who are getting a lot of attention now because that's the way the cultural winds have been blowing. It's one of the areas that's most active, I think. It's probably harder at Albertine where, first of all, I think contemporary French poetry seems very closed off to us in some ways. It's very austere, and I don't think it's that popular in France either, even. It's a challenge. Yes, it's a challenge. So I think that it's probably not at the forefront of contemporary cultural chic. But I think if you think about who are the modern poets who have been most influential in American culture, if you start with Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Apollinaire, the whole French modernism has had a huge impact, and everyone knows these are among the greatest.
And which ones are your favorites?
Well, Baudelaire is my absolute favorite.
You want to read something?
I don't have him here, actually, but I have a secret dream of translating Baudelaire. Oh. I don't know if I could do it, though, because the great secret of Baudelaire is his deceptive simplicity, the seemingly prosaic straightforwardness of those beautiful lines, beautifully metered lines, beautiful natural rhymes that you hardly even notice. That's so hard to do.
You've had many challenges, like from publisher, you became poet and then novelist. So, and you've been translating from Italian. Exactly. So why not taking on Baudelaire?
Well,
we've been a bit jealous of the Italians anyway. So
I have done a few French translations, but in school I started with Latin and French, and we were lucky we had French teachers from France who were really, I remember my most memorable French teacher in high school was a man named Roger Roch, and he was a very stern and difficult but very funny and great teacher. He called me Dégueulasse.
Why?
Galassi.
From Galassi. Yeah. Dégueulasse meaning disgusting.
Yes, that's the kind of person he was. But he was a great teacher, and he had us reading books like Les Choses by Georges Perec, which was pretty
challenging. What age were you at that time?
15 or 16.
Yeah, to read Les Choses by Georges Perec is at 15. This is what you do in France.
Right.
So it's quite amazing that you were doing it in America.
Right. It was very, in a way, you can see why, because it's very concrete. It's all nouns, basically, right? But we really learned French well.
Excellent. And so are there other French authors or poets that you would like to read from?
Well, I have two I want to read you.
Excellent. I'm curious to know what you've chosen.
And at this point, Jonathan takes out the second secret literary object, a piece of paper that is nearly 40 years old. It is the only copy of a translation he did of Brise Marine by Mallarmé. He wrote it on a typewriter.
This is my first translation I ever did of a French poem. It's Mallarmé, Brise Marine. I won't read it in French. I won't insult you by that, but I'll read you my translation. And I wrote this in 1970. So, the flesh is sad, and I have read all the books. Escape away. I see birds drunk to be among the unknown foam and the sky. Nothing, not gardens mirrored in the eye, O nights, nor my own lamp's deserted light on the blank sheet whose whiteness keeps it white, nor the young wife, her baby at her knee, will hold back this heart steeped in the sea. I will go, steamer with the swaying mass, lift the anchor for exotic coasts. A kind of boredom which has found hope cruel, still believes in the handkerchief's farewell. And perhaps the mass inviting gales are like those the wind bends over keels, sunk with no masts, and no green land. But hear my heart, oh hear the sailors chant.
Congratulations. Even if I'm not a native speaker, I feel all the beauty of it.
I wrote this in a class for Elizabeth Bishop. She was my teacher. And one of our assignments was to translate a poem, which was wonderful. But there's a line, something about la femme allaitant son bébé. So, as she said, well, you can't say the wife nursing her baby because the rhythm was wrong. So that I had to change it, her baby at her knee. But I just remember how I learned from that about the differences of stress in the lines of French poetry and ours. It's so different because every word has equal stress.
Yeah, like just saying your name for me is a huge challenge. Jonathan Galassi, it's so difficult.
But in France, you wouldn't say it that way.
No,
Galassi.
It took me to repeat like 20 times to get it right. Jonathan Galassi. It's very challenging for a French person. So let me go back maybe to the authors you've published, the French authors. And, for us, it's always like a sort of enigma also. Like most recently, Edouard Louis, this young French author who wrote this book, En finir avec Eddie Bellegueule, about growing up in a working class and being gay in the north of France. He has had a great success. Like now, anytime I meet an American author, he's always telling me, "Oh, I love Edouard Louis. Oh, I've had lunch with Edouard Louis." So that's great. And people read him. It's all about talent, of course, but I guess there are other elements. So what advice would you give to young French writers to be, translated and successful in America?
It's a really good question. Because I was thinking about this as I was walking over here today because, as a publisher, our job is to try to find interesting, valuable books to present. And our product, really, our creation, is our list itself. It's the variety and interest and depth and of what we publish. So our job, from our point of view, is not to do a tour d'horizon of French culture and have the absolute best things. We'd like to do that, but we couldn't fit that into what we have to do that with German books, Italian books, Japanese. We're trying to create a list for American readers that showcases the best or very good things from other cultures that we can sell. But there's a hit or miss quote. Our information is not always perfect. And there are also books that work in one culture and don't work in another. For instance, I always loved Jean Echenoz. He was an author. I never could find a way to publish him. He has been published in English, but not with any great success. It's just because his humor and his wit don't really translate into our language in any way that's particularly useful.
But I have to say, you've picked like some of the greatest French authors. And so Emmanuel Carrère, he's fantastic. And Edouard Louis and Maïs de Kerangal. So all of those are fantastic. So how was your experience editing those French authors?
Well,
is it really a question of personality and it's very different from one another?
A number of the people who work at FSG or have worked there are very experienced. Mitzi, do you know Mitzi Angel? She grew up in Brussels. She's bilingue totally. She's done translations herself. Lauren Stein, when he was working with us, also...
He's a translator of Houellebecq.
Right. So having people like that working with us has been very instrumental in the quality of our engagement.
But how is it like editing books published in translation? Because then it's really editing the translation, I guess.
Yes.
So it's a very different work.
It is. The first requirement of a translation is that it be good English. If you're going to choose between an accurate, clunky translation and a poetic, maybe less accurate, which one would you want to read? It's about turning art from one language into art in another. And accuracy is secondary to... If the real accuracy is capturing the voice of translating that voice, and then little details...
So you don't work that much with the authors, you work more with the translators?
Sometimes you consult with the author about the translation.
Okay.
But I'm a firm believer that what matters is that it's like the spirit of the work has been put into the translation, and then you have to deal.
And I have to say that the work of translators, we are very much in admiration of that, and I think it's totally overlooked. And that's why we created a literary prize, the Albertine Prize, where we give money not only like it's for French books published in English. And so it's a readers vote prize, so the readers, the American readers tell us which books they prefer. But we make sure to recognize not only the author, but also the translator, because he or she plays a crucial role in this process, and they are quite too often overlooked. And it's so difficult to translate this voice and style from one language to another. I'm so admirative of that.
I am too, and I think it's an underappreciated art.
Absolutely. And talking about another author you publish, I was curious to get your point of view. I wanted to talk about Michel Houellebecq, because he's a phenomenon, not only in France, but also in the US. Just to give you an anecdote, 2 years ago, he was supposed to come to speak at the cultural services. So the event was sold out in 10 minutes. We had 400 people sitting, and then they waited patiently for 2 hours, and Houellebecq never came. And they were not mad at him because it's part of his legend. They were expecting it. So
they got what they came for.
Yeah, I think it even reinforced this image. Yes. So I was really curious about, I think he's today one of the best-selling French authors in the US, and definitely the most well-known living French author in the US. So how do you explain that?
I think his profile has grown slowly. He's always been a bad boy, a negative, someone who says no to contemporary culture as it is. The book that really catapulted him into a bigger popularity was the one that came out right at the time of the Charlie Hebdo event. Submission. And, it's really it's an ironic book about politics in France and about culture war between Muslims and it's very, very artful and provocative, and people are alert to that. His new book, which we're going to be publishing next year,
Serotonin,
is even more that way. So we're anticipating even more noise, but I think that it's good to have that kind of, how would you say, that ferment, intellectual ferment. And it's totally genuine with him. That's who he is. I can't imagine he's a very happy man,
I don't know, but I guess that's not the question.
Will you invite him again?
I didn't invite him. The truth is that he was there, and somebody asked me, do you want to do an event with Houellebecq? And I said, of course I want to do an event with Houellebecq, because I knew that we could have filled Carnegie Hall with Houellebecq.
Yeah.
But then there was a big risk, and we knew it, and I think the people who came knew it, so that's why nobody was really mad.
Yeah.
So, but that was...
But it's
an interesting
as you say,
experience.
It's part of his mystique.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you have so many years of publishing experience. I cannot resist. Who for you are the not to miss French authors of today?
Well, I feel that our little bouquet of contemporary writers is a very good one, and I feel that in France there's a lot happening in fiction that is very translatable right now, and so. I'm Binet is wonderful. I love my
Binet had a huge success here, thanks to you, with Ash.
I think that, I think it's a very good moment in fiction, actually. I think that's true in Italy also. There's a lot happening in the novel that we can understand. There have been periods when it was more difficult, I think.
I wanted also to ask you some more general question about the publishing work today. What is your take on Amazon? And do you see Amazon as killing your industry, the publishing industry? Or do you think it's in fact obliging you to be more creative?
Well, I don't think Amazon wants to kill publishing. Sometimes I think we think that, but they want to squeeze us and get as much out of us as we can. And they have had a very destructive effect on bookstores, you know. So, but it's also true that, and I think, I mean, actually, sometimes when I go around all the little bookstores in France, I just wonder how they're going to survive, because if people actually buy their books online, even if they have price protection, which you have for books, it doesn't work if you don't buy
Go
books there.
Yeah, and
right.
more and more people are buying on Amazon. Even if you're like reluctant, I'm sure like at Christmas, a lot of people all of a sudden bought things on Amazon, even if they're against it.
And they're there. You can get the books. They're always there.
Yes.
So that's I mean, there are certain things about the internet for the buying of books that are wonderful. There's access, and you can get the books, whereas you don't have to. And also the fact that you can, almost any book that has ever been published is available somehow. And so this creates a long tail, as we say, where almost everything is available, which is an amazing thing. If you think back to even 20 years ago, it wasn't that way. You had to hunt around for things. There was a sense of discovery, but there was also, you had to
spend a lot of time.
Harder.
And
but
so
that also affects the sale of new books, because if there's so many other books always available, it's hard. That's one reason why new books don't sell quite as many as they used to.
Oh, yeah, because it's a lot of competition. You're competing with
the history of literature.
That's a lot of competition.
Yeah.
And so, so one obvious effect is to, like, the disappearance of bookstores. But in your industry, in the way you work, like how Amazon and more generally the internet has changed. I guess it has changed things profoundly, but how?
Well, they're our major customer, so we have to deal with what they want in terms of, and we have to try to protect also bookstores like Barnes and Noble,
which was the enemy some time ago, and now it looks like the little nice cute bookstore.
Exactly, I totally agree with you.
Which is so funny.
Yes, it's totally. They destroyed a lot of smaller bookstores, and now they're hurting. It's an irony, of course. That'll probably be true of Amazon too someday. But I think Amazon is not. They're our frenemy, as we say. They enhance publishing in some ways, and they also are a very, very, they're like a cobra that can squeeze you to death. They want to squeeze you but not kill you,
So in 2014 you became a chevalier in the French Order of Arts and Letters, which is like a distinction that we give to people who have done a lot to share French culture abroad. So did that mean something to you? And if so, what?
Oh, it meant a huge amount. I remember once, maybe 15 years before, I'd been on some trip to Paris of publishers, and we'd been in the Palais Royal. Some other people got these awards, and I thought, I would love to
be a chevalier.
Yeah, someday. And so it was very meaningful, because it made me think that there's a connection between what I do and what is there, and that somehow that link between cultures is meaningful, and I was very, very delighted by that. And it also, one thing that's very meaningful to me about France and Italy is how much cultural heritage means to the self-definition of the French.
Yeah, cultural heritage and also cultural connection. Like our whole work is really to try to have this connection between cultures. And I think, obviously I believe in my job, and I think it's so important today, like to be this bridge between culture, to create these links. Yeah. And I saw in some interviews that you describe sometimes yourself as a cultural mediator. And so why is it important to you?
Because the more you know about other people, the more you understand them, and the more meaningful life is.
So thank you very much. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Do you have like a favorite museum or cafe in Paris, or a place where you go?
Well, I love so many things, but my favorite places in Paris are the Palais Royal and the Jardin du Luxembourg. Those are my two favorite.
I agree with you. Because what is so interesting with the Palais Royal is that it's not only beautiful, it's at the very heart of Paris, but also it's quiet. And this is the paradox of it, because you would think in that place it wouldn't be quiet, but it's so beautiful and quiet.
Yeah.
The Thing About France is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks to 6e Son for our music and to Force Majeure for our look and feel. For more information, visit thethingaboutfrance.com. Allez, c'est fini.